Yeah. Because on a skim read, you have God know of any other occasion where God seemingly provoked people to sin, and then God allowing the sinner to pick the punishment. I can't really think of many examples in the Bible where that actually occurs. It also seems unjust because the one who supposedly was the sinner goes unpunished and many people go punished. So to me, on first reading, I find that whole story all a little bit awkward, very unfair, and so I thought I'll have a look at this and try and see, is there a context to this story? Is there perhaps a little bit a way of reading this that makes more sense as we would understand the whole context of the Bible? And so hopefully by the end of the night, I can at least set your mind on thinking in a particular direction, or you might say, no, you've got this all wrong, and I think you should go back to how you originally thought about it. A lot of the foundation of this story, I actually think, happens in verse 1. So we're actually going to spend a bit of time in verse 1 of 2 Samuel 24. Because at the very start of this story, what are we told? We're told about God's anger. So verse 1 says, "And again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, 'Go, number Israel and Judah.'" When, and this is a question, so if you feel the need to yell out the answer, please do. When was God angry? Yep, generally, whenever they turn to idols. But in this story, when is God angry? At the beginning. God's angry at the start of this story. It's not at the end. So that's something to bear in mind at the very start of this chapter. He was angry before the numbering of Israel actually took place. The numbering of Israel, it seems, was what actually just brought about his anger to a point of judgment, in which he said, right, this whole scenario needs punishment. The other thing to note is, who is God angry against? Sorry? Israel, not David. Okay? It's Israel that God is actually angry against. And to have that in your mind in this story, then that starts to build a slightly different picture on how then we might have a surface reading of it. It was not against David or any individual in particular, but as a nation as a whole. There was something going on within that nation that God was angry about, and this is very important as it starts this sort of a reasoning behind why there was a more universal punishment that comes later on. Note, this is not the first time God had been angry with Israel. As it says in verse 1, "And again the anger of the Lord was kindled." And it's actually likely that the previous time he was angry, if you want to go back there, is just a few chapters before. It was in 2 Samuel 21. And it most likely seems that this is the other time that God was angry with the nation, because there's a fair few parallels with the story. So first of all, in verse 1, we have, "Then there was a famine in the days of David 3 years, year after year, and David inquired of the Lord and said, and the Lord answered, 'It is because of Saul and for his house of blood, because he slew the Gibeonites.'" So God says it's actually, as we got there in that first row there, it was because of what Saul did that there was a famine for 3 years. And you'll find that in our story tonight, 3 years of famine was at least an option that David could have picked. The question then, I suppose, is why was there a famine going on for 3 years? Well, God's answer to that was because Saul had nearly wiped out the Gibeonites. And you think, who cares? Nation of Israel wiped out a lot of people. Why is God so upset that Saul tried to wipe out the Gibeonites who were not Israelites? The answer is in verse 2. It says, because Joshua, hundreds of years before, made a covenant with the nation of Israel saying, we won't ever wipe out the Gibeonites. And do you remember the story with what the Gibeonites did? How they got to make that covenant with Israel? Deception. Yeah, they pretended they'd travelled a long distance and, they'd run out of food and all that sort of thing. Turned up to Joshua and Joshua said, yep, okay, we won't destroy you as a nation when we come across you. And so they went away. Gibeonites all happy. Then probably the next week or so, Joshua then runs into the Gibeonites in the next city and he's going, well, what happened here? But because he'd made a covenant saying, well, we won't wipe you out, he couldn't kill them. So he made them servants, I believe, basically. But that was hundreds of years ago. Saul had clearly forgotten about this, as well as the nation, and they'd started to wipe them out under Saul's rulership. And God said, no, you made a covenant. Covenants are serious things, and I want you to keep them, even if they were not very wise covenants when you made them. And so, again, you'll notice the Gibeonites got to choose the punishment on that occasion. They said, right, give us 7 of Saul's sons, and once we've killed them, we'll be happy with that. That's what happens. And then the land, you'll notice there in the last row, God was entreated for the land. And that idea that God sort of lifted the famine at the end of chapter 21, that idea of God being entreated for the land is also the conclusion of our story tonight in chapter 24. So there is a point of connection between these two events and how God was actually angry at Israel because there was a national sin that was occurring, and it was not just with an individual, although Saul was the instigator of it. Something was again occurring within Israel that God was angry about. And all of Israel needed to know that it was wrong, what was going on. So, back in chapter 24, verse 1, David numbered Israel. But the question is, who moved, in verse 1, or provoked David to do it? In the verse, it says, he moved David against Israel, or against them. And on first reading, it actually reads as though it was God who moved David to do this. And you'll notice if you've got an old school King James margin, which probably, got a few at the front. We'll go to the margin and we'll find it says Satan. If you have a footnote, I no doubt it says the same thing. It says the he there is Satan. So in other words, it's the Lord was kindled against Israel and Satan moved David against them. So, and you'll actually find that in the parallel record, this is in 1 Chronicles 21, that's actually what it says. On the screen it says, and Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel. Satan was who provoked David to number Israel. Now, it's often perhaps taught in our first principles sort of style classes that this is an example of when God is called a Satan. And we would have necessarily no problem with that explanation of God being a Satan, as to us the word simply means an adversary, and God can be an adversary towards people. The problem I have with reading it this way is that the provoking was toward sin. And that's where it makes me a little bit uncomfortable. And this becomes more of a difficult explanation if God was the Satan in this case. Another suggestion is that this Satan was actually a person. And to me, in the context, this actually makes more sense. To give you an example of when people were called Satans, particularly in that period of time, we have a list of Solomon's Satans in 1 Kings chapter 11. The first one, and you can colour this in, and I think this is a brilliant chapter to demonstrate that Satan can simply be a person, because all it is an adversary. If you go to that verse there, you'll find that Hadad the Edomite was an adversary or a Satan to Solomon. A few verses later, it then says God raised up Rezon the Syrian to also be a Satan. And then this one, who we know to be prominent within the history of Israel, was Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Now, he was not given the title Satan, but that's exactly what he was to Solomon. He's described in every way that that's what an adversary is. He was a Satan to Solomon. Now, I tend to think that the Satan was a person, but not like these instances. These were, well, except for the last one, the first two were foreigners. I actually tend to think that the Satan here that provoked David to number Israel was within Israel itself, perhaps even one of David's own counselors or advisors. Because I think this Satan was agitating that David should take some active steps to shore up the kingdom. The Satan wasn't from a foreign power, I believe, but from one of the tribes, this Satan was about trying to stop the other tribes of Israel from becoming too powerful. And this was about a gathering rift that you find in the story between Judah and Benjamin and the other 10 tribes. Now, the reason I think that the Satan was a person within Israel who was agitating that there should be some sort of war between Judah and Israel is because of who objects to this whole numbering of Israel. Who is it that says this numbering, this census you're going to do, David, it's wrong? Who was it that actually objected to it? Let's read verse 2. For the king said to Joab, the captain of the host, which was with him, go now through all the tribes of Israel from Dan even to Beersheba, and number you the people, that I may know the number of the people. And Joab said unto the king, now the Lord your God add unto the people how many soever they be, 100-fold, and that the eyes of my lord the king may see it. But why does my lord the king delight in this thing? Notwithstanding, the king's word prevailed against Joab and against the captains of the hosts. And Joab and the captains of the hosts went out from the presence of the king to number the people of Israel. So the people who were actually against this whole idea of numbering was Joab and the captains of the army. David's argument was with the military captains about knowing how many fighting men there were. Joab especially saw this as an idea that was completely wrong. But surely in Joab's position, wouldn't you want to know how many fighting men you had? If you're the captain, if you're the commander of an army, wouldn't you want to know how many men you had in your army? Now, in the Chronicles record, so there's a parallel record to this, there are a couple of other things added to Joab's words, which I think hint at this idea that the census was all about how many soldiers David had and how many soldiers the 10 tribes of Israel had. If you go over to 1 Chronicles 21, I think there's a little hint here. First Chronicles 21 and verse 3. So same story. There's a few different added words in verse 3 from Joab. And Joab answered, "The Lord make his people 100 times so many more than they be. But my lord the king, are they not all my lord's servants? Why then does my lord require this thing? Why will he be a cause of trespass to Israel?" So Joab, obviously, there was a fair few arguments going backwards and forwards, and he tries from a lot of different angles to try and stop David going ahead with this census. And his argument hints at what this census was actually about and what potentially the problem was. First of all, he tries to take, I suppose, the high ground, and he says, "You shouldn't be worried about numbers, David. God will look after his people. It's not about how many we have and how many they have." And this, I think, is Job's second argument, is where this idea comes out that this is really all about a civil agitation, a civil war that's brewing. Because Joab says, "Aren't they all David's people?" Now that's an odd argument to make if the census was about numbering of how many were in Israel's nation as a whole versus, the Philistines, because the Philistines clearly weren't David's people. A foreign nation aren't David's people. But if this is about seeing how many fighters Judah has versus Israel, then this makes a lot more sense. The 10 tribes of Israel were his people. They were meant to be. And if this is about internal division, then Joab's comment about causing a trespass against Israel makes more sense. God would not want his nation to be at odds with each other. He would not want his nation to be divided. Making a count of how many soldiers Israel had versus Judah would surely only promote this unrest within the nation. But was this true? Was there an unrest amongst the tribes? Was there a growing division between Judah and the rest? There definitely was. We sometimes think that the split only occurred at Rehoboam's time. It began years before that. It actually, you can see it happening at the very start of David's reign. And it really picked up momentum under Absalom, David's son, his rebellion. I won't be going through all these, but the first one there, David was made king of Judah only, remember, for 7.5 years. Judah only. Then it's not until 7.5 years later that then the elders of Israel, note this is a different group within the nation, the whole nation. The elders of Israel, i.e. the 10 tribes, anoint David king over all their tribes. Then in chapter 15, what we find is, remember Absalom? Good-looking bloke, sat at the front gate of Jerusalem, and he stole the hearts of Israel. Now, I know the terminology gets confusing here because Israel often refers to all Israel, but sometimes it refers to just the 10 tribes. But it's interesting that Absalom steals the heart of Israel. He says, "What tribe are you from?" "Oh, there's no one here to look after you. Oh, I'm here. I'll sort out your problems for you." And so a civil war begins to brew. People then start to take sides. And I've got there in fine print a whole list of verses which demonstrate this greatening divide between Judah and the rest of the nation. But it's this one here that I think let's go and have a look at. It's 2 Samuel 20. Because it's not like a little story that you don't think much about. This is in the times of David. David is king. 2 Samuel 20 and verse 1. And then I want you to, there'll be a phrase in here that I want you to tell me then who else uses that same phrase. So 2 Samuel 20 and verse 1 to 2. "And there happened to be there a man of Belial whose name was Sheba, the the son of Bichri, a Benjamite. And he blew a trumpet and said, "We have no part in David, neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel." So every man of Israel went up from after David and followed Sheba, the son of Bichri. But the men of Judah clave unto their king from Jordan even to Jerusalem. The division of Israel did not just happen to occur in the time of Rehoboam. It had well and truly started many years before that. And so was there a phrase in there that anyone picked up that someone else would later on use? Did anyone do ancient history with Mrs. Hindmarsh? She'd be very disappointed if you don't get it. Jeroboam. 1 Kings 12, he says that same idea of we have no part in David, neither have we an inheritance in the son of Jesse, every man to his tents, O Israel. Jeroboam uses those same expressions when he actually causes the official split between Israel and Judah. So as you can see, it's clear from the record that there is a tension within the nation between Judah and the other 10 tribes. It then makes sense that a man like Joab, who's Joab, we know he's always keen for a biff. If there's a war on, he's there. As long as he's commander-in-chief, he's leading a fight against foreigners. What you find in his life, though, he is rarely keen to have a fight amongst tribes. He does kill other individuals, but you'll find he's not keen to go and slaughter tribe after tribe. He's never keen on doing that. He didn't want to agitate civil war. Strategically, very intelligent guy. He saw that only bad could come of this census. But he lost the argument. David, in the end, was king, and in this moment, David had it over Joab, which is a rare moment. And so out he went to number Israel. He went out. If we go back to 2 Samuel 24, it actually tells us in verse 8 that it took him 9 months and 20 days to number the people. And he comes back with the result. Now again, I want you to note the breakup in verse 9. How is the census broken up? Israel and Judah. Israel, it says, has 800,000 valiant fighting men. Notice this is all about military power. Judah, 500,000. And these numbers were actually not really complete, as Joab, even after 9 months and 20 days, he's still furious that he even has to do this, and he doesn't even count Benjamin. And I think there's reasons behind why he didn't do that. And it's not until after that time, 9 months and 20 days on his return, that David admits, I've got it wrong. What I'm doing here is wrong, and it was sin. Interestingly, the Bible does not attribute this sin to David when summarising his life, despite it having huge consequences. When you get a summary of David's life, it's mentioned the sin of Bathsheba. This one's not mentioned, and you think, whoa, that was a pretty big sin as well. Why not tack that one on as well? But David, this sin is not attributed to David when summarising his life. So again, it's more about the nation as a whole. There's something wrong within it. David's included in that. So even so, David said it was sin, and God does not disagree with him. So why was it? Why was it a sin? Now, again, this is where it comes back to not having concrete answers from this chapter. A little frustrating. But perhaps goes to what Joab was actually saying. David should have put his trust in God and not in the strength of the number of soldiers that he thought he had on his side. Perhaps David had momentarily forgot who had given him the victories over all those foreign nations in the past. In this moment, he was putting his strength in what he was able to number. He was not putting his trust in God. So this census, I suppose from a David's point of view, was a demonstration of his mistrust and his unfaithfulness to God. He didn't trust God to look after the situation. Now, that may be an explanation as to why David thought he had personally sinned, and God never disagrees with him that he did sin. But why was the nation held guilty as well? Again, not directly told. But that's why I went through this idea of there being a great division amongst the nation. There's a division or a civil war brewing between Judah and Israel. Now, some suggest that when you do a census, everyone's meant to pay a half shekel, as that's what was meant to be done at census time. And if that wasn't done, then a plague would actually happen. Now, that seems to be a very straightforward connection to the story and an easy answer, but it's never mentioned that the shekel wasn't collected. But the plague was only one option of the punishments in this story. Normally when the census, if you didn't pay the half shekel, plague happened no matter what. You didn't get an option. But I think the other suggestion is that the punishment came about because of the rebellious nature that filled that nation at that time. God knew they needed punishment to bring Israel to the realization that David was God's anointed. It was through David that the promises were made. God did not want division to occur, yet there was all these people within the nation agitating for that to occur. And so punishing those who were agitating for civil war and division was the reason why a lot of the nations suffered under this pestilence that was given. So disobedience had begun in the nation, and David was either not aware of it or he was not doing anything about it, and I think it's more the latter. This was an event or a moment for God to be involved, and David was forced to act. Now, Solomon uses some words later on when the temple was completed and dedicated at its opening. Let's just go across there, because again, I think it goes back to what Uncle Tim said previously about why Israel was punished. And I think the reason on this occasion is it's because there's widespread disobedience and unrest within the nation. So 2 Chronicles 6 and verse 26. That can't be right because there is no... Oh, yeah, that is. I mean 26, not 6. All right, 2 Chronicles 6 and verse 26. This is Solomon speaking. He says, "When the heaven is shut up and there is no rain because they have sinned against you, yet if they pray toward this place," where's this place he's talking about? The temple that he's just built. Come back to that idea of where the temple was built. "Yet if they pray toward this place and confess your name and turn from their sin when you dost afflict them, then hear thou from heaven and forgive the sin of your servants and of thy people Israel, when they have taught them the good way wherein they should walk, and send rain upon the land which you have given unto your people for inheritance. If there be a dearth in the land, if there be pestilence, if there be a blasting, a mildew, locusts or caterpillars, if their enemies besiege them in the cities of their lands." Now notice there are all the punishments that David actually is offered later on. Famine, pestilence, or running from your enemies. "Whatsoever sore or whatsoever sickness there be, then what prayer or what supplication soever shall be made of any man or of all people of Israel, when every one should know his own sore, in his own grief, and shall spread forth his hands in this house. Then hear thou from heaven the dwelling place, and forgive, and render unto every man according unto all his ways, whose heart you know. For thou only knowest the hearts of the children of men, that they may fear you, to walk in your ways, so long as they live in the land which you gave unto our fathers. So really, the nation as a whole had really lost its way, I believe, in this moment. It had lost direction. It had lost sight of David as being their king. There was a rebellious spirit within that nation, and they'd lacked some sort of central focus and worship. And so that as a nation, they were quite weak at this time spiritually. And so this whole event was about bringing them back to God. It wasn't just about David, it was about the nation as a whole. And David was clearly a part of that. Because at the end result of this story, what we will find is that there is a united worship and a focus on God. And this is brought to the forefront of their existence and their society. And that's what Solomon spoke about, when they should turn to this place. And that's exactly what happens at the end of this story. So David reflects on what he's ordered Joab to do. Interestingly, it took him at least 9 months and 20 days to come to the realisation that he'd done wrong. I'm not sure if we're meant to take anything else from the length of time it took Joab, but it seems very reminiscent of the length of a pregnancy, and perhaps a little allusion to the sin with Bathsheba, because it took David that long to confess his sin. The difference on this occasion, when he confesses his sin to God, is that he does it before the prophet Gad arrives. But he knows Gad is coming, the prophet Gad, and Gad arrives, and in verse 13 it says, back in 2 Samuel 24, so Gad came to David and told him and said unto him, shall 7 years of famine come unto you in your land, or will you flee 3 months before your enemies while they pursue you, or that there be 3 days pestilence in your land? Now advise and see what answer I shall return to him that sent me. Now the Chronicles record actually says he was offered 3 years of famine, not 7. And so it's 3 years, 3 months, or 3 days of punishment for each respective punishment. David chooses the punishment that would leave him totally dependent upon God, because he at least knew God was merciful. So he picks pestilence. What did this pestilence do? Verse 15. So the Lord sent a pestilence upon Israel from the morning even to the time appointed. And there died of the people from Dan even to Beersheba 70,000 men. And when the angel stretched out his hand upon Jerusalem to destroy it, Yahweh repented him of the evil and said to the angel that destroyed the people, it is enough. Stay now your hand. And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing place of Araunah the Jebusite. Pestilence, disease. Now, to put this event into perspective so we can understand what must have been going on in this time, it's probably worth comparing it to a plague or a disease with another disease that we might be aware of. Now, I don't know if you've heard, but there was something called coronavirus going around. In 2021, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, 1,229 people died as a result of coronavirus in that year. How many died in this plague? 70,000. And that number is most likely only of fighting men, because the numbering of fighting men was the context. And due to God's mercy, the plague, I don't think, even lasted 3 days. As a percentage of the population, about 0.005% of Australian population died from coronavirus in 2021. In comparison, this pestilence, this disease, killed approximately 2% of Israel's population. That means it was about 400 times worse, and that's not even taking into account that that was all done in less than 3 days. Now, we know what upheaval and fear coronavirus has caused throughout the world. Now, imagine the panic and the fear that was generated throughout the whole land of Israel because of that pestilence. There was nothing Israel could do. Nothing. All they could do was rely on the mercy of God. And thankfully, that mercy came, as it always does when people seek it of God. Verse 16, we're told there that the angel actually said stop when it's like this angel of death went through the nation and it got to Jerusalem and God said stop, don't go any further. And the angel of the Lord at the end of verse 16 was by the threshing place of Araunah the Jebusite. Now I'm going to change his name to Ornan, because that's what Chronicles says his name is, and it's much easier to say. So it's Ornan the Jebusite. The angel of death stopped there. He didn't go any further. Now, where in particular did he stop? Well, he stops at Ornan the Jebusite's threshing floor. Now, where was that? If you have a map in the back of your Bible, pick a map that shows a zoomed up version of Jerusalem, particularly in the days of David. For all those KJVers, go to map 1. And you'll see there in a little black bold outline, you'll see the city of David. All right? What you'll find is that to the north of that little black bold area was the area of Ornan the Jebusite's threshing floor. Just a bit of geography so you know what the direction David is heading and looking. It's above or north of the city of David. Now, although Joab had destroyed these Jebusites years ago, Ornan was allowed to stay there as a puppet king. He's actually referred to as a king in verse 23. Clearly, he's not much of a king because he's now threshing his own wheat on his own threshing floor. And the prophet Gad tells David that he has to go to this place and build an altar. So up David marches. And by the time he gets to the top of the hill, Ornan is cowering with his sons, as he has also seen the angel standing nearby. You remember the bravado of the Jebusites who mocked David from their massive walls and said, "There's no way you're breaking into this fortress." It's long gone. This man Ornan's a shadow of what he was. Verse 21 says, "And Ornan said, 'Wherefore is my lord the king come to his servant?' And David said, 'To buy the threshing floor from you, to build an altar unto the Lord, that the plague may be stayed from the people.'" Now, as is clear from David's demand, the altar was the integral part to saving Israel from the plague. And this again points to what was currently wrong with the nation. There's a lack of national cohesion in direction and worship. There was more of a rebellious spirit amongst them and against David, Yahweh's anointed. So Ornan, he's actually seems quite keen to get rid of the place. He says, "Well, you can have it for free. I'll give you the whole place. I'll give you the wood. I'll even give you the animals to sacrifice." But what's David's response? Because David actually knows what's required in verse 24. "And the king said unto Ornan, No, but I will surely buy it from you at a price. Neither will I offer burnt offerings unto Yahweh my God of that which does cost me nothing." So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. So there's some discrepancy between the numbers between this record and the Chronicles record. But Chronicles also makes it clear that David wanted to buy this threshing floor for a full price. David knew this had to cost him something. Sacrifice from himself was needed. David needed to give of himself. He shouldn't be stingy about it. He shouldn't try to bargain to get a better deal. And this is the principle that God is requiring of all. God requires all to sacrifice everything. David's whole heart, mind and strength is represented in this idea that David insisted on paying the full price. I hope you start to see here what is being foreshadowed in this story. Because David then builds an altar. In verse 25, David built there an altar unto the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So the Lord was entreated for the land, and the plague was stayed from Israel. So the altar is built quite quickly, I would suggest, and sacrifices are made. And it doesn't seem like there was one sacrifice, but it seems like there was multiple offered. There's no mention, you'll see, of high priests or priests making that offering. And it reads as though David himself, I don't think he did, but it seems as though David himself was making those sacrifices. Which again, it's another sort of foreshadowing of things to come. Now, it's only when this is done that the plague is finished. The land was entreated. Again, this points to why God had been angry in the first place. Why all the nations suffered and not just David. The whole nation was in need of judgment, in need of forgiveness, in need of changing their direction. Now that sacrifice and worship had taken centre stage in the place where God had chosen, God forgave. Now, the significance of what occurred here should not be lost on us. And as I hinted before, this is a story that speaks of more than just forgiveness of Israel and a salvation from pestilence. It foreshadowed the greater sacrifice. Because what was this site that David had purchased? Go across to 2 Chronicles 3, because this tells us. 2 Chronicles 3 and verse 1. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem in Mount Moriah, where the Lord appeared unto David his father, in the place that David had prepared in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Where had Solomon built that temple? On the very same place that David had purchased, Ornan's threshing floor. But what is it that this site is linked to, or known as, in other words, Mount Moriah? Now, why is Mount Moriah significant? About 1,000 years previously, Abraham and Isaac had climbed up that very same mountain to that very same spot. And in faith, Abraham offered up Isaac. And because of this, Abraham was made righteous. Abraham was promised a seed that would then bring about salvation for all. David, now on this same spot, gave in symbol all of himself. Buys the site, buys the altar, gets the sacrifices, pays the full price. This brings about salvation for the nation from the plague. Now, both these events then point forward to 1,000 years after David, where the greatest sacrifice was also made on this same mountain, slightly different location. But Jesus Christ gave his all. It cost him his life, but he brought the greatest salvation to all from the plague and disease of sin and death. Now, the echo of this story in the life of Christ should not be lost on us. God wishes to be merciful, wishes to provide his mercy, even though we, like Israel, were yet sinners. Now, but it's only by a recognition and a bringing back to that central focus of worship, that will actually be provided. It will also be by the return of Jesus Christ that what event will happen? The reunifying of Israel and Judah. Once again, they'll be brought back as one nation. Judah and Israel will be united after many years of separation. One nation had always been intended to be in place, as this was what was the promises made to David. So I guess then what can we take from tonight? The question is then, who is your king? Is there a battle within your own mind and your own heart and in your own life about who your king is? Or is there perhaps a rebellious spirit that has crept in, that is choosing another camp to belong to? Or perhaps there needs to be a refocus, because that's what David did when he went up that mountain. All of Israel were focused on that spot, on that sacrifice, on that altar, on Mount Moriah, that would bring salvation. And perhaps we might need a refocus in our worship to come back to the sacrifice that was made for us, and to look at what occurred on Mount Moriah, thinking of the promises that we once so held strongly and so dearly. And like David, realise that all of ourselves is required and it must cost us. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Brother Steve, for that very clear explanation of the numbering of Israel by David. Next week, I'm actually not sure what's on, but there'll be something on at 6 o'clock. If you turn up, you can have a listen. We're going to close tonight before we're going to have some dinner out the back, if you like toasted sandwiches. But we're going to close by a prayer by Brother Greg Gilmore and offering thanks for dinner after we've sung hymn 402, which will be, Lord, thy judgments now are waking, let not thy compassion sleep, but while earthly thrones are shaking, sure and firm thy purpose keep. Hymn 402.
Our gracious and loving Father in heaven, you who were the God of Abraham, Isaac, and of Jacob, the God of Israel, the God of our Lord Jesus Christ and our God, we praise you for your goodness. We thank you, loving Father, for the blessing of your word and this opportunity that we've had to consider it, that we might see there the relationship that exists between sin and death, and that we're all set about by sin, and we long for the day when your Son, our Lord, who came, he who was sinless, but gave himself in service and obedience to you, even to the death on the cross. And so as he, like all of us, is subject to death, so also we, because he conquered over sin, and so you brought him forth from the grave that he might live forevermore, gives us hope of life to come, and so we thank you for that. Help us to be mindful always of that which has been accomplished because of his wonderful work, and might we submit to your good hand, and we might submit to the hand of our Lord Jesus Christ, who comes again, that the world might be subdued, and he will reign in righteousness from Zion. So we thank you, loving Father, for the things that have been spoken tonight. Help us to understand them, help us to be wise. We are mindful also that you care for us daily. You provide those things that are needful, and we long for the day when all the earth will be fed, when the problems and the trials of this age will be no more. So we thank you now for the blessings that we've enjoyed, and we thank you now for the food that's being prepared, and we pray that we might see in that a gift from you. We thank you and seek your blessing in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.